Okay, so a warm welcome to everyone here today. My name is Tracy Shield. I'm a research fellow at the University of Manchester, working with Professor Gun Grande and colleagues on the NIHR-funded research project, Evidence Synthesis of Factors Affecting Family Carers' Psychological Wellbeing. The reason this research is so important is that caring for patients at the end of life has an impact on carers' own health. The greatest impacts are on carers' mental health. Most suffer anxiety, depression, and high distress levels, and how a carer feels before bereavement predicts their mental health after bereavement. And if carers become unable to cope, they are less likely to be able to care for the person they are caring for. The aim of this research is to reduce psychological morbidity, so to reduce anxiety, depression, distress, and improve psychological well-being among family carers who care for patients at the end of life, by carrying out an evidence synthesis of factors affecting carer psychological morbidity during end-of-life caregiving, and by translating synthesized findings into accessible, tailored information for key stakeholders able to influence change, so that stakeholders will then be able to use the knowledge to improve outcomes for carers. So in terms of the research methodology that we adopted, we first carried out a structured and comprehensive evidence synthesis of both the quantitative and qualitative literature from 2009 to 2019 inclusive, which incorporated 3 separate reviews: a quantitative observational review to identify factors associated with psychological morbidity in end-of-life carers, a quantitative intervention review to identify causal factors associated with psychological morbidity in end-of-life carers, and a qualitative review to explore factors that carers themselves feel have an impact on their psychological health. This synthesis of the evidence was informed throughout the process by a Carer Review Advisory Panel, RAP for short, from involvement in the initial search strategy to advising on how best to present and use the findings in order to confirm their validity, their relevance, and their accessibility to carers. Stakeholder consultation was then carried out with practitioners, commissioners, and policymakers, and a wider group of carers and carer organisations to explore how to translate findings into useful evidence-based summaries suitable for different stakeholder groups. Stakeholders were engaged through online workshops and via an online survey. Focus group with practitioners and carers was also held to explore how the project findings may be used to inform general practice support for carers. In terms of this presentation, I will focus on the evidence synthesis and work with the carer RAP only. In terms of our inclusion-exclusion criteria, which we applied across all 3 reviews, the population we focused on were adult carers of adult patients at the end of life. Factors included needed to be associated with psychological morbidity in end-of-life carers. Outcomes we focused on included anxiety, depression, distress, and quality of life, as well as outcomes that the carer RAP considered to be important. We excluded the bereavement literature, given the focus on end-of-life caregiving, inpatient hospital settings and care homes, given our focus on supporting carers providing end-of-life care in a home setting, and anticipatory grief as an outcome. In terms of the number of studies included within our evidence synthesis, our search strategy produced 10,871 papers from 2009 to 19 inclusive, which were screened on title and abstract. And from this, 849 papers were screened on full text. Both titles and abstracts and full text were screened independently by 2 reviewers until inter-rater reliability was greater than 90% agreement, and this led to the inclusion of 64 studies for the observational review, 13 studies for the intervention review, and 33 studies for the qualitative review. To synthesize the wide-ranging literature, we started by synthesizing the qualitative literature, and the qualitative evidence identified 7 overarching factors presented here in 7 overall themes, which were shown to have an influence on carers' mental health. And these were informed by the carer RAP as useful ways of presenting the evidence. Findings from the quantitative, observational, and intervention review were then categorised into one of these 7 overarching themes. So patient condition, which relates to how carers' mental health is affected by how well the person they are caring for is doing. For example, how well the patient is able to function and the patient's quality of life. The impact of caring responsibilities, which relates to how carers' mental health is affected by their caring responsibilities, such as the carer's workload and life changes in caring for the patient. The theme, relationships, relates to how carers' mental health is affected by the quality of their relationships with both the person they are caring for and within the family. The theme, finances, which was considered to be a fundamental factor by the Carer Act. This theme relates to how carers' mental health is affected by financial pressures. Carers' own internal processes, which relates to how carers' mental health is affected by how carers think and feel about themselves and their experiences of caregiving and how they look to cope with and manage these processes. Support, which relates to how carers' mental health is affected by the support they receive, and this includes both formal support from professionals and informal support from friends and family. The final theme relates to how carers' mental health is affected by contextual factors, which is intended to provide a list of contextual information which may help to support the identification of carers at risk of poor mental health, and it includes factors such as age and gender. The research findings from the project are quite comprehensive, so to give you a flavour of the more detailed evidence from the 7 overarching themes, I'll present extracts from the findings from each type of review taken from one of the overall themes. Starting with the qualitative evidence, what you can see on screen is an example of the evidence from the theme support, which provides an example of the in-depth individual factors and corresponding quotes identified within this theme from the qualitative research evidence. And as you can see, this theme has been organised into 2 sections: predictors of psychological morbidity, which relates to individual factors which have an impact on carers' mental health, as well as a section on strategies to support mental health, so that stakeholders are able to use the information to identify factors which affect carers' mental health, and to identify helpful strategies that could support the development of future initiatives to improve the mental health of end-of-life carers. So starting with predictors of psychological morbidity, carers spoke about a lack of formal support as impacting on their mental health. Many of the carers described instances when they were unhappy with the care the patient received from healthcare professionals. When he comes home, no, there's nothing in place. Now I lost it when he came home. I just exploded, burst out into tears and really got very upset. Under the section Strategies to Support Mental Health, carers also spoke about formal support, including from mental health professionals, as helpful to them. I'm suffering from serious insomnia and I take something to make me sleep. I'm receiving counselling. I need to see a psychiatrist. Moving on now to the in-depth results from the quantitative observational review. The slide here is a summary of individual factors identified from more than one study as being associated with better or worse mental health in carers. So patient quality of life, carer self-efficacy, preparedness for caregiving, supportive family relationships, receiving informal support, satisfaction with care, older and retired carers were all associated with better mental health in carers. While patient physical functional impairment, patient in a more advanced stage of disease, greater patient symptom burden, caregiver burden in caring for the patient, conflict within the caregiver-patient relationship, financial difficulties, unmet needs, and female carers were all associated with worse mental health. As with the qualitative evidence, what you can see on screen here is an example of the quantitative observational evidence also taken from the theme support to illustrate the level of detail available on the factors affecting caregiver mental health identified from the quantitative observational research. And the purpose of this evidence is to enable stakeholders to be able to look in detail at each individual factor organised into smaller sub-themes within the overall or overarching theme of interest, in this case support, and to see the corresponding impact of the factor on carers' mental health overall, whether it was associated with better mental health, worse mental health, or reported to have no impact on carers' mental health. The numbers in each column relate to the total number of research studies that looked at the individual factor and identified a positive impact, negative impact, or no change on care and mental health for each type of mental health outcome, so anxiety, depression, distress, or quality of life, which have then been combined together into an overall summary measure, care as mental health. So, for example, the individual factor, social support from family and friends, within the sub-theme informal support, is associated with better mental health in carers. Carers with unmet needs were associated with worse mental health, while the language complexity and communication by health professionals showed no impact on carers' mental health. So the intervention review was used to assess which of our identified factors were also found to impact on care and mental health in experimental studies, and help us to further assess how likely they were to be contributing causal factors to mental health. The intervention review was therefore not carried out like a traditional intervention review. Rather than focusing on the effectiveness of interventions per se, this review served to validate and inform findings from the quantitative, observational, and qualitative reviews as to the likely causal nature of the relationships found. The factor self-efficacy presented on this slide is underlined as it was identified from more than one study, while all the additional factors were all identified from one study only. The patient social wellbeing, lower patient depression, a supportive carer-patient relationship, carer autonomy, coping patterns that included healthy behaviours, carer satisfaction with their involvement in mutual decision-making, self-efficacy and mastery were all factors that were associated with better mental health in carers. There were no factors which were associated with worse mental health from the review. The level of detail available on the factors identified from the quantitative intervention review is similar in format to what I've presented for the quantitative observational evidence, so I'll not present further detail on those here today. Okay, so that was a very brief summary of the research evidence, which I hope has given you a taster of the findings as a whole. And I'm now going to provide you with a brief outline of a set of recommendations drafted by our carer RAP after reviewing the research evidence. These recommendations are the RAP's response to how best to address the factors identified in the evidence reviews, and they are presented in the form of 6 overarching recommendations that are likely to address several factors if implemented. And these recommendations have been positively received and highly valued by stakeholders. And just to flag, these are still in draft format, so our carer RAP may still make further revisions to them. So the overarching recommendations that they recommend are awareness raising, recommending that carers are made aware of the support services available to them, and that health professionals are made aware of the need to address the impact of end-of-life caregiving on carers. A roadmap which contains all the relevant information to support carers to navigate their way through each stage of the end-of-life caregiving journey. Bespoke support which recognises carers' medical, personal and social needs and identifies them. A standardised comprehensive assessment to assess actual patient needs as opposed to their managed needs, which takes into account what the carer is doing to support the patient. Coordinated and timely care through the provision of a single point of contact for the carer, and what was considered to be fundamental by the carer RAP, practical considerations and essential resources, which includes meeting carers' basic physical needs, both during end-of-life caregiving and post-bereavement, the provision of sufficient finances, for example in the form of a decent carer's allowance, and access to practical advice, including early legal and financial advice. So in terms of next steps, we'll be looking to assess the quality of studies which underpin each of the 7 overarching themes, and to calculate pooled effect sizes for individual factors where this is feasible. We'll be looking to further pull together the project materials in order to summarise and present the project findings as a whole. We'll also be working alongside the carer RAP to develop tailored evidence-based summaries for different stakeholder groups based on feedback from the stakeholder consultation. And we'll also develop our project website as a navigable resource for all dissemination documentation. To draw conclusions from our findings to date, it is clear that factors that affect care and mental health are wide-ranging, and we cannot focus on one single factor to reduce psychological mobility among family carers who care for patients at the end of life, whether it be patient condition, impact of caring responsibilities, relationships, finances, carer internal processes, support, or contextual factors. Findings from different literature reviews all contributed to similar themes, albeit with a different emphasis on the themes identified. Working throughout the project alongside a carer RAP was hugely important, as RAP members were able to act as a lens to validate, present, and interpret research findings. And if you're interested in further details of the research project, please visit our Carer Project website. Finally, I just want to say thank you to all my colleagues for their input and support into this project, and thank